All right, thank you. Um, so this is a feed-forward or a bottom-up network. In a network like this, you have an input. The input goes through multiple stages of processing. And then at the end, you could read out that representation for different purposes. It could be recognition, it could be segmentation, it could be any task that you're interested in. Models that have been trained for object recognition have been fairly successful in computational neuroscience on the cognitive level to predict the neural activity of ventral visual pathway. And when people try to learn encoding models from the representation to the activation of different layers, they see this coarse correspondence from different layers of these networks to different layers of the ventral pathway. But most of the test that is done with time average signal or with fMRI signal, which is already inherently averaged. But there is a lot of dynamics in the representation, even during recognition, that these models would not be able to capture. One thing to note here is that the areas, PIT, central IT, and anterior IT, in the graph that I'm showing on the left, I replaced them with face patches because a lot of this research is done in face patches, and I'm going to talk about that more. So I've replaced them with ML, AL, and AM, but they roughly correspond to those areas in terms of where they're placed. Just wanted to point that out. So what are the interesting dynamics that we would want to capture beyond the feed-forward sweep? Well, it's been around for, like, let's say a few decades that people have thought about that. We probably don't need to analyze the representation in all its details initially, right? You could have a stage of processing that you get the gist information, and then later on you could analyze the details more. More recently, there has been more suggestions that you could even go as far as calling this somewhat of a gating mechanism, where you could go from detecting a category to actually separating members of the category. So you could go from face detection, which is the separation of faces from non-faces, to face discrimination, which is the separation of faces from each other. You could imagine that these two classification tasks are inherently different in how much details they need. So it makes sense that the brain would do this across time. And these sorts of changes are mediated by all the connections that are in the brain. So in the ventral visual pathway, beyond the feed-forward sweep, we have all these different connections. You have top-down connections I'm showing here. You have a lot of skip connections. You have top-down skip connections. You have IT directly modulating V1, for example. So all these connections, what they do is that they bring in later responses, and they can modulate the responses in earlier areas, which in turn can turn the responses later on and change that. So those dynamics, we think, are very interesting. So in the lab, we have this project where we're trying to systematically go from feed-forward network that I'm showing on the left to networks that are far more connected with all these skip connections, lateral connections, and top-down connections, and skip top-down connections. So this is a systematic exploration of this space that we're very interested in. But for now, let's focus on just a simple model where you have recurrence within each layer, where basically it's a feed-forward network, and within each layer, the activation is recurrently fed. If we unroll this model, even this somewhat simpler model has a very complex computational graph. And I'm calling this biological unrolling because we're really, each connection kind of takes the same amount of time. That's debatable. But what we're showing here is that while the input goes to V1, it goes to V2, V2 could feed back to itself, and then, or feed forward. There are all sorts of paths here. Just to give you an impression, if you look at a model like the brain that has all these skip and double skip and all those sorts of connections, you get a really complex computational graph. And something to note here is that there are all these paths connecting the input to the output. In recurrence, you could do that. And this is, I mean, to me, one intriguing way to think about this is a form of self-ensembling, where you have all these paths in this network that could make your system a much more robust. But back to this, I want to show you some exploration of this network. All these connections that I'm showing while they are weight sharing are convolutional. It's a simple convolutional. If there are downsampling, we use a max pooling, if that means anything to you. Besides having all these different architectures, we also wanted to explore different data sets, different tasks and everything. So for example, we trained the model, the BL model that I showed you, which is bottom-up and lateral, on face identification, VGG phase 2, on object categorization, and on ImageNet plus VGG phase 2. And what I'm showing here is that if we make our feed-forward model a little bigger, where the parameters match the recurrent model, we're going to get the same level of accuracy. So a lot of people have thought that, well, if it's a recurrent system, you can make it more accurate. That's not necessarily true, right? If you have bigger feed-forward models, and if they're constructed the right way, they could get similar accuracy as the recurrent model. So that's something to note. We believe recurrence helps you in other ways, in hopefully robustness, that's the direction we're taking it, but also in just explaining the neural activity. So based on the time I have, I'm just gonna go into one thing that I think is very interesting and I mentioned earlier, which is this process of can we really capture going from face detection to face discrimination. So I'm gonna show you some analyses of the representation of the last layer of this recurrent system. We're taking images from faces, and those are blurred for privacy, but there are human faces, monkey faces, and non-faces. And we're gonna line them up, order them, the human faces, monkey faces, and non-faces. We feed them to a network, and then we get the representation from that time step. And we could now draw what we call a representational similarity matrix or representational dissimilarity matrix. What you see here that each grid pointer is the similarity, it's the Euclidean distance between the representation of those objects. It's the same object for the row and the column. So you would expect that, for example, in this representation, the human faces are similar to each other, monkey faces also similar to human, but they're different from the non-faces. If we look at across the time steps in our network, we see something like this emerging. What this tells you is that as the time steps go on, human faces are becoming more dissimilar to one another, and the objects are becoming kind of similar to each other. So in a way, the representation of faces is expanding and the representation of objects is collapsing. So it's the dynamics that we're interested in. We could also look at the multidimensional scaling figures, human faces in yellow, monkey faces in this teal, and then non-faces in a dark color. You could see that in earlier steps, faces are clustered, they're separate from objects. But as you go on across time steps, faces are being pushed away from each other, and the representation of objects are being collapsed. So in a way, we're going from face detection to face discrimination. So we capture the dynamics that people have shown in neural activity. When we test models that are only trained for object recognition or a combination of object recognition and faces, you could see that we don't see it to some extent. So for object recognition, we don't see the faces expanding because the model doesn't have a detailed representation of faces. When we have half of that category for objects, half category for faces, we see something in between. So this is an interesting thing that we get these dynamics, and we're very interested to better capture these dynamics. And there are a lot of people in this room who have done that. So we're interested to apply some of those ideas to recognition. With that, I thank you and collaborators, and we have the code available for our networks if you want to try them. Thank you.